We always knew that the economic collapse of China was coming. So you would have an industrial collapse, a civilizational breakdown, and mass famine within 6 months. Here's the Chinese demography in 1950, standard pre-industrial pyramid. 30 years on, here we are. This is early industrial China, and this is the shape that terrified Mao. He saw a young and upcoming generation that would literally eat China alive, and his solution was the one-child policy. Years after one child, we get this. Not a lot of kids, but that big bulge of people in their 20s and early 30s. When Americans look at this, we see an up-and-coming generation that's going to take away everyone's engineering jobs and manufacturing jobs. When the Chinese look at this, they see an up-and-coming young generation of spenders that are going to remake consumption norms. We were all correct. Were. Past tense. Because here's China now. As of January of 2020, when this data was pulled, China was already the fastest aging society in human history with the biggest sex imbalance. We already knew that their economic model would not match up with this demography this decade. We always knew that the economic collapse of China was coming. But since this data came out, the Chinese have started releasing parts of their 2020 decade census. And they're now grudgingly admitting that they overcounted their population by about 100 million people. And that the truth is probably closer to this, with the yellow bars just not existing. This would suggest that by the year 2050, there'll be half as many Chinese alive as there are now. I don't see how China survives as a single political entity, much less a globally significant one. I don't see how it survives this decade with these numbers, because this suggests that the Chinese population peaked back in 2003, and that Chinese economic efficiency probably peaked around the same time, and that we've already been on a relatively accelerated slide. We're going to go into a number of other China adjacent issues in the rest of this presentation and show how each individual one is a regime killer. This is just the first. I do not worry about China at all. Now, if you're in the Navy, I can understand why there's some heartburn there. It's like you're probably preparing for a war that will never happen, but I'd rather you do that than what the Russians have done and not actually prepare. But I do not think that we are going to find ourselves in a world where we have to face down China, because I do not think there is going to be a China for very much longer. We can't confirm this. We can't just go to China and look around and count noses. But here are some data that are like demographics adjacent that we do trust. So this is the average wages for a number of Southeast Asian countries that I think we should be interfacing with more, because I think they're going to do very well in the future. Here are our Mexican compadres, very competitive. Here are the Chinese. This is the fastest labor appreciation in human history, including during the Black Death, including during all wars. So we're looking at a 15-fold increase since 1999. Their labor effectiveness, productivity, is probably only increased by a factor of 2, maybe 3. There is not an industrial process that is done in China that can't be done in North America at a lower cost, because our labor is so much more productive, our energy is so much cheaper, our supply lines are so much shorter, and you can produce stuff where people actually live, so the transport costs are minor. The only reason we think of China as a major industrial player is because of the sunk cost of the pre-existing industrial plant. You don't rebuild that somewhere else overnight, but it is happening. The United States is already in the process of its fastest industrialization, even faster than what we did during World War II. But it's a lot to move a few $1 trillion of industrial plant from one place to another. You don't do that overnight. We're living in the moment right now. We probably need to double the size of our industrial plant in the next 5 to 10 years. That'll be awkward, expensive, inflationary, but on the other side of it, we will have a far more insulated and secure supply chain system. The problem is just getting from here to there, and that is not a straight line. There are a lot of bumps. The Chinese plan has always been to let the Russians go first, just to kind of as a proof of concept. And so their thinking was a fast war that conquers Taiwan in a matter of days, that imposes a done deal upon the world, and everyone just sucks it up and takes it, because China is too economically powerful to be challenged. And once you hold the territory, there's no point in going to a broad-scale war against the Chinese when it's already happened. That's always been their plan. Oh my. With the Russians, they have had every aspect of all of their planning for the last 40 years set on fire and burned to ash in less than a month. So, number one, it will not be a quick war because Ukraine was one of the world's less militarily competent countries in the first place, and they're still holding it out against the Russians. Taiwan has been preparing for this war since 1955. Taiwan has a moat. Taiwan has a nuclear program that started in 1974. So if we have a 2-month accumulation of Chinese forces getting ready to push, the Taiwanese will see it because this is the only national security question that they pay any attention to. And they will make a nuclear device. And so the only way that the Chinese can even make an attempt on Taiwan is to text all of their soldiers at the same time and just say, everyone get to the coast, take a fishing boat with your buddies, and start moving on Taiwan. They know it is going to cost them 1 million troops just to get there. So it's always been a heavier carry than we would ever consider in the way that we operate. But for the Chinese, they know baked into the equation that it's going to be 1 million troops lost before they can even start the real war. And they now know from Ukraine that it's not going to be a pushover. It's not going to be, because, Taiwan is mountainous, it's forested, as opposed to Ukraine, which is flat and open, and very few forests. Russia has many flaws, but they're a massive producer of food and energy products. If you put the sanctions that we have put against Russia onto China imports 85% of their energy, 85% of that from the Persian Gulf, and they import 85% of the inputs that are necessary to grow their food. So you would have an industrial collapse, a civilizational breakdown, and mass famine within 6 months. And then you would probably lose 500 million Chinese over the course of the next year to famine. But I think the one that has scared the Chinese the most are the boycotts. BP and Halliburton didn't have to leave. They weren't doing anything that was sanctioned. But the super majors and the oil services firms and countless other firms left on a moral imperative prompted by individual shareholders and consumers. And in China, the idea that the average Joe or Jane can influence policy is so antithetical to their mindset that they had no idea this was even possible, much less it was going to happen. So everything that the Chinese have based their system and their strategic policy on for the last 30 years has been proven in the last 2 months to be utterly wrong. And they have to come up with a completely new plan. I don't think they can. I don't think they have that capacity anymore. And so we just have Chairman Xi slamming his head into the wall over and over and over, incapable of change until his skull cracks. And that's where we are now. I see China with not just a demographic failure, but a failure of leadership, a failure of policy, an agricultural failure, and an energy failure all at the same time. It is entirely possible that this is the last year of the People's Republic. The Chinese don't have a very high value-added economy, and so in that sort of environment, if you are willing to dumb down labor costs, and if you're willing to dumb down environmental restrictions, it does give you a leg up. Absolutely. But because the United States produces energy at home versus importing it from several thousand miles away, our energy costs are so much cheaper. And because our educational system is so much better and American workers are so much higher value added, we have now reached a point where the math has flipped. And Chinese labor has become so expensive, it obviates all those other advantages. So like Mexican labor is half the cost and more highly skilled than Chinese labor, and that makes a big difference too. And remember, I said North American, so we do have a partner in this that makes the math work that way. I'm not trying to suggest that labor restrictions and environmental restrictions don't come at a cost. I'm also not trying to suggest that all of them are necessary. We have 50 states with 50 different labor markets and 50 different environmental sets of regulations, and some of them obviously are better at dealing with this than others.